When Karen's patience with her neighbor's barking dog finally snapped, she thought calling in the authorities would solve everything. But what she unleashed was far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Fake HOA cops running a dirty scam that could destroy the entire neighborhood. Over the course of several weeks, Karen's frustration with her neighbor's dog steadily escalated. What began as mild irritation during the occasional barking session soon evolved into genuine resentment. To Karen, the barking wasn't just a temporary nuisance. It symbolized a lack of respect from her neighbors and a disruption to the peace she believed she was entitled to. Every morning, the dog's excited yelps as people left for work, combined with the persistent afternoon barking when delivery trucks passed by, fueled her sense of injustice. Karen's complaints, initially muttered under her breath or shared with a few sympathetic friends, grew louder and more frequent. Karen believed she had exhausted all reasonable avenues. She had spoken to the dog's owners once, leaving a terse note another time, and even called animal control, who had visited but taken no serious action. In her mind, the system had failed her. The perception that no one was willing to enforce basic neighborhood standards convinced her that more drastic measures were necessary. Her patience, thin to begin with, finally snapped when the dog barked nonstop during a weekend afternoon barbecue she had planned meticulously. She could barely hear her guests over the noise, and the embarrassment she felt hardened her resolve. In her search for a solution, Karen stumbled upon a group that claimed to work alongside local homeowners associations to restore order in neighborhoods suffering from noise complaints, improper landscaping, and other alleged violations. The website looked convincing enough, filled with official-sounding language about community standards enforcement and neighborhood tranquility services. Eager for relief, and not inclined to question what seemed like a godsend, Karen quickly reached out to them. Their prompt response, a polished, reassuring voice promising swift action, reinforced her belief that she was finally taking the right step. The so-called HOA officers presented themselves with an air of authority, wearing uniforms that vaguely resembled those worn by security professionals and carrying clipboards loaded with paperwork. They promised Karen that they would address the problem firmly but fairly, and importantly, without any need for her further involvement. This hands-off assurance appealed greatly to Karen, who was eager to distance herself from any potential neighborhood backlash. All she wanted was quiet. How it was achieved seemed secondary to her. Karen's desire to see quick results blinded her to several warning signs. She did not notice that the officials provided no verifiable credentials, nor did they specify which HOA they claimed to represent. Her neighborhood had a homeowners association, but she was not aware of any authorized enforcement agency tied directly to it. Her relief at finding someone to fix her problem outweighed her instinct to scrutinize the situation further. Trusting them, she offered details about the dog's owners, pointing out their house, sharing her history of complaints, and describing in exaggerated terms how the barking had allegedly disrupted the entire street. The group promised that they would handle it through a compliance operation, language that sounded official enough to Karen to soothe any lingering doubts. In her mind, the wheels of justice were finally turning. She envisioned the dog's owners receiving stern warnings, possibly facing hefty fines, and finally being forced to control their pet. She imagined the barking ending for good, allowing her to reclaim the peace she believed had been unfairly taken from her. Meanwhile, Karen's interactions with the supposed officers grew increasingly cooperative. She even allowed them to use her driveway as a staging area, unknowingly granting them proximity to the entire neighborhood. Feeling empowered by the upcoming intervention, Karen began to tell other neighbors about the enforcement action, warning them that stricter regulations were being implemented and that any violations could be dealt with just as swiftly. She basked in the brief sense of authority she felt, believing she had championed the cause of peace and order for everyone around her. What Karen failed to realize was that her decision to involve outside authorities without proper verification would open the door to consequences far greater than any barking dog could have caused. Her eagerness to silence one problem would soon give rise to a much larger one, a full-blown scam operation targeting her neighbors. Unwittingly, she had unleashed individuals whose real aim was not community order but financial exploitation. Her personal frustrations, unchecked by caution or due diligence, had paved the way for opportunists to prey on an entire community. In her single-minded pursuit of peace, Karen had overlooked the basic principles of accountability and transparency, ultimately compromising the very stability she sought to protect. As the so-called HOA officers began preparing their next moves, the first seeds of mistrust and conflict had already been sown in the neighborhood, seeds that would grow into something far more disruptive than a dog's bark ever could have been. When the fake HOA officers arrived in the neighborhood, they immediately made their presence known with an air of authority and confidence that instilled a sense of unease among the residents. Their uniforms, though clearly designed to look official, were generic, featuring a logo that appeared to have been hastily designed rather than one that could be easily traced back to a legitimate homeowners association. However, the officers' carefully constructed appearance, combined with their professional demeanor, made it difficult for most people to question their legitimacy on the spot. They were prepared with a script using authoritative language and terminology that made them sound like the enforcers of a well-established system. Their approach was calculated and deliberate, designed to intimidate and confuse anyone who dared challenge their authority. The officers wasted no time in establishing their dominance over the residents. They began by knocking on doors, presenting themselves as enforcers tasked with ensuring compliance with neighborhood regulations. As soon as a resident answered, the officers spoke in a commanding tone, presenting what appeared to be official citations that listed fines for a variety of infractions, most notably violations related to noise, yard maintenance, and pet control. The citations, while professionally printed, were nothing more than cleverly crafted pieces of paper meant to intimidate and extract money from those who didn't think to challenge them. The fines were steep, often in the range of hundreds of dollars, and residents were told that if they didn't pay immediately, they would face additional penalties, which could include court appearances and further legal action. For many residents, the shock of receiving such an official-looking citation was enough to silence any doubts they might have had. The officers were persuasive, explaining the importance of adhering to HOA regulations for the sake of community harmony. Some residents, especially those who were more compliant or didn't want to risk confrontation, handed over money without a second thought. Others tried to argue, questioning the validity of the citations or asking for proof that these officers were authorized to enforce such fines. However, the officers had a well-rehearsed answer for every challenge. They referred to the HOA rules with vague references to community guidelines and property standards, often claiming that those who resisted would face further legal consequences or have their names added to a list of violators. The fear of escalating matters or facing a future legal battle kept many from pushing back too hard. The fake officers also used intimidation tactics to manipulate residents into compliance. They didn't just issue fines, they threatened to take further action if residents didn't comply. One officer would stand at the door while another took notes, making it seem as though the residents' every move was being recorded. The idea of being singled out as a troublemaker was enough to keep many in line. Those who hesitated were told that they could be reported to the actual homeowners association, which they were assured would take swift action against them. The idea of a formal HOA complaint being lodged added another layer of pressure, especially since many people were unaware of how these associations truly operated. In some cases, the officers even made house visits in pairs, with one officer engaging the homeowner in a conversation while the other slipped unnoticed into the backyard or front yard to inspect the property. During these inspections, they would find seemingly small infractions, such as a garden gnome placed in the wrong spot, a slightly untrimmed hedge, or a pet that had been left outside for too long, and use these as leverage to demand money. They would claim that unless these issues were addressed immediately, further fines would be issued. When confronted with the truth that the officers had no real power, they would quickly shift tactics, making their threats more aggressive. If one officer was challenged, another would step in with even greater force, reiterating the potential legal consequences and the damage it could cause to a resident's reputation within the neighborhood. The fear of embarrassment, coupled with the genuine confusion over whether these officers were legitimate, kept residents on edge. By the time they had visited the first handful of homes, the fake officers had already collected several $100s in fines, even from residents who initially hesitated. The more skeptical neighbors were left feeling powerless to resist, unsure of how to proceed. A subtle, yet constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty began to spread through the streets. The officers played on this fear expertly, making the neighborhood feel as though they were under constant surveillance, and that any mistake could lead to a costly fine. The officers also made sure to leave behind a sense of lingering doubt. They handed out fake business cards for a supposed HOA compliance department, which promised to be available for any questions or follow-ups. These cards looked polished, and the contact information appeared legitimate. For many residents, the presence of this card reinforced the illusion that these officers were connected to an official HOA entity, further suppressing any doubts about the situation. As the day wore on, the officers' tactics became increasingly brazen. They targeted specific properties, looking for any minor infraction to exploit. The idea was simple. They sought out residents who were more vulnerable or less likely to question authority. The elderly, in particular, were prime targets, as they were often more intimidated by confrontational figures in uniforms and less likely to challenge their demands. In some cases, the officers even convinced residents that their fines could be waived or reduced if they made a voluntary donation to a supposed neighborhood fund, a tactic designed to extract even more money from unsuspecting victims. At first, many residents didn't talk to each other about the fines they had received, assuming that their situation was unique. But as the day went on, a pattern began to emerge. A few more aware neighbors began to compare notes and realized that they were all being hit with similar fines for minor or non-existent violations. This raised suspicions, and the first seeds of doubt were sown. But by then, the damage had been done. The officers had already walked away with a significant sum, leaving residents questioning what had just transpired and wondering if they had been duped. In this way, the fake HOA officers skillfully manipulated fear, confusion, and a lack of awareness to line their pockets, while quietly sowing distrust among neighbors who were too intimidated to speak out. The fallout from their visit was only beginning to unfold, but the residents' initial responses to the officers' demands marked a turning point, one that would eventually lead to the community uniting against this fraudulent operation. As the days passed, the initial shock of receiving the citations began to wear off, and more residents started discussing the events that had unfolded. At first, everyone had assumed the officers were legitimate. After all, their uniforms, their confident demeanor, and the official documents they handed out seemed convincing enough. However, as the community began to compare notes and share their experiences, inconsistencies began to emerge and doubts started to surface. One of the first signs that something was amiss was the way the fines were issued. The citations, while seemingly official, were vague in their details. They lacked critical identifying information, such as clear contact details for the issuing authority, a specific HOA name, or a proper seal that would typically be associated with an official document. Furthermore, many of the fines seemed excessive and disproportionately harsh for minor infractions. Residents who received fines for relatively benign issues such as a misplaced trash can or a hedge that was slightly out of shape found themselves paying hefty fines with no clear explanation of how these rules were being enforced or who was actually setting them. The more they looked at the documents, the more it seemed like the fines were randomly determined with little regard for actual regulations or fairness. Another glaring inconsistency that started to raise suspicion was the officers' reluctance to provide any verifiable information. Several residents who attempted to ask for credentials or proof of the officer's affiliation with the HOA were met with vague responses or outright evasions. One officer would claim that he was with a local compliance agency, but when asked for the agency's name or a contact number, he would either fumble through his papers or suggest that residents call a number he had written on a business card, which upon closer inspection appeared to be a personal cell phone number rather than a business line. This lack of transparency about their supposed affiliations only fueled growing doubts. The residents couldn't help but wonder why such a professional-looking operation lacked basic credibility. Some residents also began to notice a pattern in how the officers operated. The fake HOA cops seemed to target certain individuals in the neighborhood more than others. People who were generally known to be quieter, more introverted, or less likely to cause trouble were often hit with fines. Meanwhile, those with louder personalities or a more assertive presence were rarely approached. This selective enforcement pattern led many to believe that the officers were exploiting easy targets, residents who would not question their authority or risk confrontation. The blatant disregard for equal treatment only deepened suspicions that the officers were acting in bad faith, and many residents started to question whether they were truly part of an HOA enforcement group at all. Adding to the confusion, the officers would often give conflicting explanations for the same alleged violations. Some neighbors who had received fines for loud pets were told that the dog in question was a public nuisance, while others were told that noise complaints were the result of violating HOA regulations. This inconsistency in the reasoning behind the citations made it clear that the officers were improvising their responses, possibly to keep the residents on edge and unsure of how to challenge the fines. It became evident that there was no solid foundation for the citations. They were nothing more than a means to intimidate residents into paying fees under false pretenses. The final straw for many residents was the realization that the officers had never once provided an official means of payment. While they had demanded immediate fines from residents, they never supplied a secure way for people to pay the alleged charges, nor did they offer receipts for the payments they did collect. This lack of transparency regarding payment procedures began to seem highly suspicious. Residents who had handed over cash or checks with the expectation of getting some sort of confirmation found that they had no proof of payment and no way to track the money that had been given to the officers. This inconsistency in how the fines were handled only further convinced residents that they were being scammed. It wasn't long before word spread that these officers might not be who they claimed to be. A few brave individuals who had received citations began to research their local HOA's enforcement practices, only to find that nothing remotely resembling the fines or the officers' actions were part of the HOA's usual procedures. In fact, they discovered that the HOA had no official policy of sending outside agents to enforce minor infractions like yard maintenance or pet noise. When they tried to contact the HOA for clarification, they were told that no such enforcement group had been authorized to operate in the neighborhood. This revelation was the final piece of the puzzle for many residents who now realized they had been deceived. As more people became aware of the inconsistencies, they began to speak out and share their experiences. A sense of collective skepticism spread through the neighborhood, and the first seeds of resistance were planted. A group of residents who had been particularly upset with the officers' treatment came together to discuss their options. Some were initially hesitant to take any action, fearing retaliation or further intimidation. However, as the evidence against the fake officers mounted, the idea of allowing the scam to continue without challenge became increasingly unpalatable. With growing outrage, residents began to question what they could do to protect themselves from further exploitation. At the same time, Karen, who had been the one to initially call in the fake officers, began to feel the weight of her decision. Her actions had, whether intentionally or not, opened the door to a serious scam that was now affecting her neighbors. While she had been motivated by a desire to silence the dog and restore her sense of peace, she had unwittingly invited chaos into the community. As the doubts about the legitimacy of the officers mounted, Karen found herself caught in a difficult position. Her belief that she had been helping the neighborhood now seemed naive, and she was left wondering how to rectify the situation without making things worse. The realization that the officers might not have been legitimate also sparked a series of conversations about accountability. Many residents wondered how they had failed to spot the signs of a scam earlier and how they could have prevented the situation from escalating to this point. The lack of skepticism in the face of what seemed like authority had allowed the scam to unfold unchecked. This realization led to a renewed focus on the importance of vigilance and verification in their daily interactions with anyone who claimed to have authority over the neighborhood. As the community grappled with these issues, they began to see that the scam had exposed deeper vulnerabilities in their approach to authority and civic engagement. The doubts that had surfaced about the fake officers became the catalyst for change, a movement toward greater awareness, unity, and vigilance as residents realized the importance of verifying every claim of authority before accepting it as truth. It was a painful lesson, but one that would forever change the way the neighborhood approached authority and the boundaries between citizens and those who claimed to serve them. As the truth about the fake HOA officers spread through the neighborhood, a growing sense of unity began to take hold. Residents who had once been isolated by their fear and confusion now found strength in numbers. The collective realization that they had all been victims of the same scam sparked a wave of determination. They knew they had to act quickly, not only to stop the fraudulent officers, but also to recover the money that had already been taken. The neighborhood was determined to ensure that no one else would fall prey to the same deception. The first step was to gather evidence. Several residents who had been hit hardest by the fake citations began comparing notes. They exchanged the details of the fines they had received, the officers' behavior, and the information or lack thereof they had been provided. What quickly became apparent was that the officers had used remarkably similar tactics on everyone they encountered. Each citation was formatted in the same way, with vague details and inflated fines. Residents who had paid the fines in cash found that they had no receipts, and those who had written checks could not find any trace of the supposed HOA compliance department to which the checks had been made out. The residents also began to notice patterns in how the fake officers operated. They had all used similar intimidation tactics, threatening legal action or further fines if payments weren't made immediately. They had provided no legitimate contact information, only vague promises of follow-up. These similarities helped strengthen the case that the officers were part of a larger scam rather than a legitimate enforcement operation. Once the evidence had been gathered, the next logical step was to contact real authorities. Several residents, particularly those who had been more skeptical from the beginning, took it upon themselves to reach out to the local police department. They explained the situation in detail, sharing everything they had gathered, copies of the citation, photos of the officers, and testimonies from those who had been scammed. The police were initially skeptical, but as the residents presented more evidence and demonstrated the clear pattern of deceit, the authorities began to take the matter seriously. The real turning point came when the local homeowners association was contacted. It turned out that the HOA had no knowledge of the officers, nor had they authorized any enforcement operation in the neighborhood. This was a critical piece of evidence, as it confirmed that the officers were not affiliated with any legitimate HOA. The HOA provided official documentation of its policies, which were then compared to the citations handed out by the fake officers. The discrepancies were glaring, further proving that the scam was, in fact, a fraudulent operation. With the support of the police and the HOA, the residents began to work together to coordinate their efforts. They started sharing information with each other and discussed the next steps in ensuring the perpetrators were held accountable. The neighborhood began to organize a more formal investigation into the scam, and several residents volunteered to take charge of documenting everything from the officers' methods to the financial transactions that had taken place. A group of residents even began to track down the officer's vehicle, which they had seen parked in different parts of the neighborhood on multiple occasions. They used this information to establish a pattern of movement, which helped the police narrow down the potential whereabouts of the scammers. As the investigation gained momentum, the residents also realized they needed to ensure that their community was better prepared to deal with such scams in the future. They held meetings to discuss how to recognize fraudulent operations and how to protect themselves from becoming targets. This newfound solidarity was not only about exposing the scam, but also about making sure their neighborhood was stronger and more vigilant moving forward. They shared resources on how to verify the legitimacy of officials whether they were from the HOA or some other organization, and emphasized the importance of asking for credentials and researching any outside authority before agreeing to any demands or payments. The final breakthrough came when one resident who had kept a detailed record of the officer's visits managed to track down one of the fake officers. After some discreet investigation, the police were able to connect the officers to a larger criminal operation, one that had been targeting neighborhoods throughout the region. The scammers had been using similar tactics in multiple areas, exploiting residents who were too trusting or too fearful to challenge their authority. This information allowed the police to move forward with an investigation, culminating in the arrest of several individuals involved in the scam. By the time the fake officers realized that they had been exposed, they had already moved on to other neighborhoods. But their escape was short-lived. Thanks to the collective efforts of the residents and the involvement of the police, the scammers were caught before they could get away with the tens of thousands of dollars they had stolen. The neighborhood, once divided by confusion and fear, now stood united in victory. They had exposed the scammers, recovered stolen funds, and sent a clear message that fraudulent behavior would not be tolerated in their community. The residents' victory over the scammers was a testament to the power of unity and vigilance. It proved that when a community comes together, even the most well-organized scams can be unraveled. It also served as a valuable lesson for the neighborhood about the importance of being cautious and questioning authority. The experience left the residents stronger and more aware, and they made a pact to remain vigilant, knowing that scams like these could always resurface if they weren't careful. In the end, the residents not only recovered their stolen money, but also restored their faith in the strength of their community. They had faced down a powerful scam and emerged victorious. As the investigation concluded and the perpetrators were held accountable, the neighborhood was left with a sense of pride in their ability to stand together and protect each other from exploitation. And while the memory of the scam would linger, it would also serve as a constant reminder of the importance of verifying authority, remaining vigilant, and always standing up for what is right. In the aftermath of the fake HOA officer's scam, the entire neighborhood was left to process the experience. What had begun as an isolated incident of deception had turned into a powerful lesson about trust verification and the importance of unity within a community. The residents had learned firsthand how easily they could be manipulated when they failed to question authority or verify information. Yet, despite the initial chaos, the collective effort to expose the fraud ultimately brought them closer together, fostering a sense of vigilance and solidarity that would remain long after the scammers had been caught. One of the most significant lessons the neighborhood learned was the importance of trust and verification. Before the scam, many residents had been content to trust official-looking figures and documents without hesitation. The officers' uniforms, their authoritative demeanor, and their promises of community regulation had all seemed legitimate. It wasn't until the inconsistencies in their behavior started to add up that people began to question the situation. The lack of transparency, the refusal to provide contact details, and the vague explanations for the fines all pointed to a reality that many were initially too trusting to see. However, once the scam had been exposed, the residents recognized the necessity of scrutinizing authority and verifying any claims before complying with demands. They realized that not every person who appeared in uniform or presented an official-looking document was automatically trustworthy. This realization had a profound impact on the way the neighborhood would approach authority moving forward. A culture of skepticism emerged, where residents were encouraged to ask questions and to seek proof of legitimacy when confronted by anyone claiming to have power over them. The HOA began to circulate information about how to properly verify the credentials of any official or organization, ensuring that everyone understood how to differentiate between a legitimate HOA officer and someone trying to pull a fast one. The neighborhood also adopted a more proactive stance in staying informed about the rules and regulations governing the community, as ignorance had been one of the key factors that allowed the scam to thrive in the first place. While the lessons of trust and verification were crucial, perhaps the most lasting change was in the sense of unity that the scam had ignited. In the beginning, the residents were divided. Some feared the officers, others didn't know how to resist, and a few tried to speak out but lacked support. However, once the scam was uncovered and people began to share their experiences, the sense of isolation began to fade. Those who had initially felt powerless found strength in the collective effort to expose the scam. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before began working together, pooling their resources, sharing information, and standing up for each other. The bond they formed in the face of adversity was one that could not be easily broken. The neighborhood's newfound unity was not just a reaction to the scam, it was a proactive stance against future threats. Residents became more willing to communicate with each other, whether it was to discuss potential scams, share experiences with local authorities, or simply look out for one another. They began to establish new neighborhood watch programs, organizing regular meetings where they could talk about security issues and stay updated on any potential fraud attempts. These efforts were fueled by the recognition that the strength of a community lies in its ability to support and protect its members. At the same time, Karen, who had been the catalyst for bringing the fake officers into the neighborhood, found herself facing the consequences of her hasty decision. Her actions, though motivated by a desire to resolve a problem with a noisy dog, had inadvertently caused a chain reaction that led to a widespread scam. She had acted without fully understanding the ramifications of calling in the officers, and her belief that she was solving a neighborhood issue had instead led to a financial and emotional burden on her neighbors. Once the scam was exposed, Karen struggled with the realization that her well-intentioned actions had played a key role in the deceit that had impacted so many. The fallout for Karen was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The neighborhood, having bonded over the experience, was no longer inclined to be forgiving. Although some residents understood that her intentions had not been malicious, others felt betrayed. They had relied on her judgment and assumed that she was acting in the best interest of the community. Now, with the full extent of the scam revealed, many struggled to reconcile her role in the situation with their sense of trust. Karen, for her part, was deeply regretful. She had not anticipated the consequences of her actions and was left to confront the damage done to both her relationships with her neighbors and her reputation within the community. In the months that followed, Karen attempted to make amends by participating in community meetings and offering her support in the aftermath of the scam. She helped organize the neighborhood's efforts to increase awareness of scams and improve communication channels. Yet, despite her attempts to rebuild her standing, it was clear that the damage to her reputation was significant. Trust, once broken, could not be easily restored. While many residents appreciated her efforts to right the wrongs, others remained wary, unsure if they could fully trust her again. It became evident that Karen's journey to regain her standing would be a long and difficult one, as the community had learned an important lesson about the need for caution and critical thinking, even from those with good intentions. Karen's experience, while painful, mirrored the broader lessons that the neighborhood had learned. Her role in the situation became a cautionary tale about the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions and considering the potential consequences before acting impulsively. In a way, her mistake served as the final real-world lesson that reinforced the neighborhood's commitment to questioning authority, verifying information, and maintaining strong, supportive relationships within the community. Ultimately, the neighborhood emerged from the ordeal more connected, more vigilant, and more aware of the dangers of complacency. They had been tested by a scam, but they had also been strengthened by it. The unity they forged in the face of adversity became the foundation of their future interactions as they resolved to protect each other and maintain the integrity of their community. The lessons learned from the fake HOA scam would not soon be forgotten, and the residents, empowered by their collective action, were now more prepared than ever to face any challenges that might come their way in the future. Stay vigilant and protect your community. Subscribe to expect stories for more eye-opening tales and lessons learned.